Welcome back to Exploring the Old Testament. I'm Dr. Hutchins, and in this lecture, we want to discuss the tabernacle and the temple so that you can have a really well-rounded understanding of this most important aspect of the life of the nation of Israel and God's mission in the world and what He is doing through the nation of Israel. So, in the book of Exodus, God commands Moses to build a tent where he will dwell in the midst of his people. And that tent is what we call the tabernacle, or sometimes the tent of meeting, because it was where God would meet with his people, where God would dwell in the midst of his people. Then later in the biblical story, David would desire to convert this tent into an actual permanent building. So Moses builds the tabernacle around 1400 BC, 1400 years before Christ. David has that desire, but it's not actually until his son Solomon. Solomon is the one who actually fulfills that desire of building the temple. And that's around the year 960 BC. So just roughly between 400 and 500 years after the tabernacle is built, then it is shifted into this building called the Temple in Jerusalem. That building would then be destroyed about 500 years later in 586 BC by the Babylonians, who came and destroyed the city of Jerusalem, burned it to the ground, destroyed the temple. When the Jewish people returned from their Babylonian exile under the leadership of Zerubbabel around the year 520 BC, they would begin to rebuild this temple. And the rebuilt temple would not be as magnificent as the Temple of Solomon. It was in many ways a disappointment. And that's why 20 years before Jesus is born, Herod the Great, Herod who is the Herod from the Christmas story, begins this major remodel of the temple. Actually, it's almost a complete reconstruction, so that the temple in Jesus' day is quite grand. And that temple then would be destroyed in the year 70 AD, 70 years after the birth of Jesus, by the Romans, who would conquer the city of Jerusalem, destroy the temple. And of course, today, the Temple Mount is still there, but there's no temple in Jerusalem. Instead is the Islamic shrine, the Dome of the Rock, and the Al-Aqsa Mosque, where it's believed by the Muslims that Muhammad actually ascended into heaven, had this midnight journey between Jerusalem and heaven and Mecca. And it's a sacred place to Muslims, but of course before that it was a sacred place to the Jewish people, the Israelite people, because that was where the temple in Jerusalem was. Some Christians believe that at the end of time, for the events that would lead up to the Antichrist, the Great Tribulation, and the return of Jesus, it requires the temple to be rebuilt there on the Temple Mount. Other Christians believe that some of the passages that may refer to a temple in the end times are meant to be understood symbolically as referring to what today is the temple where God dwells, which is in his church among the people of God. So there's disagreements about what the future temple will be like, but there's no doubt that the idea of the temple is absolutely, and the tabernacle before it, is absolutely fundamental to our understanding of the Old Testament and also the New Testament. Now, why is it fundamental? It's fundamental because it is the place where God dwells in the midst of his people. Even when they were wandering in the wilderness, when they built that tabernacle, God commanded that it be placed at the center of the camp. So you have 12 tribes of Israel, right? So those 12 tribes are divided by 4 into groups of 3. So you have 3 tribes dwelling to the east of the tabernacle, 3 tribes that would set up their camp to the north, 3 tribes that would set up their camp to the west, 3 tribes that would set up their camp to the west, so to the south. So quite literally, the tabernacle is in the midst of the people of Israel, and there in the tabernacle is where God dwells with his people. Later, when the tabernacle would be settled in the promised land, it would be settled first at the town of Shiloh, which is the geographical center of the land of Canaan. Later, it would be moved to Jerusalem, but still Jerusalem is very much kind of the geographical center of the promised land, so that God is dwelling in the midst of the people. And so when we get to the New Testament, this idea continues, but it is transformed. God is communicating through the tabernacle and the temple that he wants to dwell with his people. So when the Apostle John in the Gospel of John describes the coming of Jesus, he writes, "The Word became flesh and dwelt among us." That's John chapter 1, verse 14. The Word is Jesus, who is the eternal Son of God, who's always existed, and yet he takes on humanity. He comes and he dwells among us. Now that word translated dwelt among us, dwelt, that word means to pitch a tent and live in the tent. It's a picture of Jesus himself taking on the role of the tabernacle, so that he is now the place where God's people meet with God and encounter his presence. Now, when we think about the tabernacle and the temple after it, we see a very clear communication of who God is and how he dwells with his people in the design of the buildings. So there are three divisions of the tabernacle and the temple. There is the courtyard. So there would be a fence, if you will, that was first made of skins, later made of a wall, but that is outdoors. So you enter through these gates and you are in the outdoor part of the tabernacle called the courtyard. And this is where people could come and they could offer their sacrifices through the priests, and they could offer their prayers. But then you have the building itself, and that could only be entered by the priests. Your regular Israelite could not go into the building itself. Only certain priests at certain times could enter into the tent. Now, when they entered into the tent, they entered into the first room of the tent, which is called the holy place. There are a few things in the holy place that we'll describe in a moment, but this was a place where the priests were constantly ministering and doing the tasks that priests do in ministering to God's presence in worship. But then there was a curtain that was a scarlet or purple curtain that had embroidered on it two cherubim, two angels, and behind this curtain was called the most holy place, or the Holy of Holies. Now, this curtain is communicating that God's presence itself is beyond this point. No one can go past this except for the high priest, and he can't go past it at will. He can only go through the curtain with his sacrifice on the Day of Atonement to sprinkle it on the Ark of Covenant. Now, these two angels, these cherubim, it's not the first time that we see these two angels when we encounter the description of how this is to be built. It goes all the way back to Genesis chapter 3. When God exiles Adam and Eve from his presence, he puts at the entrance to the garden the cherubim. He puts these two angels to guard the way to God, his presence. So these are those same two angels now embroidered on the veil, saying to the people of Israel, you are not allowed past this point. You cannot go and dwell directly in the presence of God. And so this is a very important statement of of what is happening. Now, when we read about the designs of the tabernacle and even more of the temple, we read a lot of descriptions about things that are supposed to be embroidered, things that are supposed to be built. There's a lot of designs of trees and flowers, and there's a real garden theme that is given to the building itself. And it's meant to remind the worshipers, remind the priests of the Garden of Eden, where God dwelled originally with man. The tabernacle and the temple are like a new Garden of Eden, where God is reigning on earth, where he is with his people. And yet, because of sin still existing among the people, there's still that separation, symbolized by that curtain with the cherubim, that God's people cannot come yet directly into the direct presence of God like Adam and Eve could before sin. It's only through the atoning sacrifices that are going to be offered on behalf of the people. When these innocent animals die for the people of sin, that's the only reason that God can dwell at all with the people without destroying them, because he's a just God. He's a just God who must punish sin. And yet when these sacrifices are given, he then can give mercy to his people and dwell in their midst. What's interesting is when Jesus dies on the cross as the final and full sacrifice for sin, what happens? We read in the book of Matthew, chapter 27, verse 51, that veil in the temple was ripped from top to bottom. It was like those cherubim were stepping aside and declaring that now the way is open for people to finally enter directly into God's presence. And we do that through faith in Jesus Christ. So we who are believers are now living in the direct presence of God because what? The Spirit of God himself, the presence of God at the moment of faith comes to dwell within us. And we have the hope that one day when we die, we will go to be with God. And even more so, that after Jesus' return, we will resurrect and we will enter into a new creation where we will dwell with God face to face for all of eternity. That we will dwell in a universe that is actually the temple of God, because that's where God's going to dwell with his people. Now, a couple of comments on some of the different furnishings of the tabernacle and the temple that have some significance before we end this lecture. First, in the courtyard, there was a bronze altar where the sacrifices were given, and there was a bronze wash basin, or sometimes called a sea, where the priests could wash themselves and purify themselves. These two things are symbolizing the fact that God must punish sin with death. There must be death. There must be sacrifice in order for God to grant mercy to his people. And yet also that God's promise is also to purify his people. And so there's the wash basin. When the priests entered into the holy place, there they would see on one side the table of the bread of presence, where there was constantly these 12 loaves of bread symbolizing the 12 tribes of the people of Israel that would be put there, replaced regularly and eaten by the priests, which is representing that God is providing constantly for his people. There is the lampstand that is there offering light and must always be burning. This 7-branch candelabra, that there is an oil that is burning constantly and giving light, and a reminder that God is the guidance of his people. And then right before that curtain, but on the side where the priests are ministering, is the altar of incense. There they would burn incense, and the smell would go up and fill the temple, would go before the Holy of Holies, which was a symbol of the prayers of God's people being offered in the presence of God. And then when the high priest would enter beyond that curtain into the Holy of Holies, That's where the Ark of the Covenant is. Everybody loves the Ark of the Covenant. Indiana Jones was looking for the Ark of the Covenant. He found it apparently. Apparently it's in a storeroom. The U.S. government has it. Other people think it's in Ethiopia. That's one of the big questions. What happened to the Ark of the Covenant? Well, we don't know. But what we do know is that there was an Ark of the Covenant, this box that was overlaid with gold. On top of it were two more cherubim, again pointing back to the Garden of Eden. And that was seen as both the footstool or the throne of God's presence, where God actually dwelled with his people. Inside was the tablets of the covenant, the tablets of the 10 Commandments, showing that God is dwelling with his people on the basis of a covenant that he's made with them. And it's there that the high priest would enter once a year on the Day of Atonement and sprinkle the blood on the mercy seat, pointing forward to the sacrifice of Jesus, where Jesus, our great high priest, would offer himself as the final complete sacrifice for sin and enter into not a physical tabernacle on earth or temple on earth, but enter into the Holy of Holies in heaven itself and offer his own blood before God so that he could reconcile us to God, so that we can now enter into God's presence and dwell with him by faith through the grace of our Lord Jesus Christ.